20 Worst Divorces in Old Country Music History. Country love songs promise midnight miracles, but the life behind the microphone is rarely tidy or fair. This is not a tour of polite farewells where smiles stay glued and lawyers exchange gentle handshakes. This is a sprint through 20 ruptures that bent careers, minted folklore, and taught Nashville that romance and business keep separate ledgers. No stage directions, no soft filters, no mercy for myths that never paid the bills. What keeps these stories alive is not scandal alone, but the way wreckage becomes fuel for the next chorus, the way a private argument turns into a public hymn, and the way 1,000 small endings gather into one big truth people recognize. Country survives because someone keeps writing in the middle of the mess, and when the mess clears, there is a line that feels written for your own kitchen. George Jones and Tammy Wynette proved that chemistry on stage can outlive peace at home. He was Mr. Possum with a voice that could fold a barroom into prayer. She was the first lady with a torch that never flickered. Touring loved them and drained them. Booze stalked the calendar, apologies landed late, and the marriage wore thin in full view of people who bought the records. By 1975, the papers were signed and the split turned into a national template for heartbreak. Yet their post-divorce duet still felt like postcards from neighboring islands, beautiful and lonely at the same time. Fans did not choose sides. They chose verses, carrying those lines back to houses where real arguments waited. The legacy is not the court file, but the proof that a blend of voices can keep singing even after the vows go quiet. They ended the marriage, kept the catalog, and taught radio that chemistry can be cordial or combustible on command without asking permission from real life. Hank Williams and Audrey were the original storm warning. Audrey managed, pushed, argued, and told him the truth when the crowd only begged for more. The road blurred days into one long hallway, and the need for the next hit made home feel like a motel with no checkout. Pills and pressure sharpened every quarrel. Their 1952 divorce rang across Nashville like a church bell, and a year later Hank was gone, leaving the myth to outrun the man. People still debate blame, but the records do not take sides. They remain a monument to a marriage that cracked under the weight of genius and refusal, a reminder that talent is not a shelter from weather that starts in the kitchen and rolls straight into the studio. Somewhere between church pews and honky-tonks, they traded promises for survival, and the tape never stopped rolling while the roof shifted above them. Johnny Cash and Vivian Liberto learned that destiny for the stage can feel like absence at the dinner table. Vivian kept birthdays and quiet bravery. Johnny kept miles, motel keys, and a gravity toward June Carter that grew louder with every duet. The public saw fate. Vivian saw a family sliding toward an empty chair. Their 1967 split closed one book and opened another as the Man in Black myth rose. Redemption songs landed harder because redemption cost something and the receipts were paid by people off stage. The lesson is not that love failed, but that distance collects interest, and even legends cannot pay off every debt once it is compounded. Vivian's book later told the quieter side, the laundry and lunches that do not fit a tour poster but define the cost that legends leave behind. Garth Brooks and Sandy Mahl introduced new math to break up culture. When your catalog is a printing press and your audience shows up by the stadium, the border between personal and professional turns foggy. Their 2001 divorce became shorthand for the cost of empire, a figure repeated in whispers like folklore. But the better story was the reset that followed. Garth stepped back, learned to count hours with the same care he counted dollars, and returned sounding steadier and sharper. Co-parenting under floodlights is a discipline, not a ballad, and he treated it like work worth doing. The lesson outlived the headlines, a reminder that stadium economies still depend on kitchen calendars and that fame cannot parent for you when the gear is packed. Kenny Rogers and Maryanne Gordon discovered that fame can make a ledger louder than a love story. They had hits, magazine covers, and a smile the cameras trusted. Then the numbers arrived, and the headlines added zeros until the split read like legend. The shock was never that two adults ended a marriage. It was the scale. Kenny could sell a chorus with one wink, But even he could not sweet-talk a balance sheet. He kept moving, stayed gracious, and reminded the world that a gentleman can survive scrutiny without surrendering charm. Behind the punchline sat accountants, appraisers, and long afternoons of inventory that turned a house into a spreadsheet with echoes in every room. Randy Travis and Elizabeth Hatcher Travis showed how power can poison romance. Mentor became manager, manager became spouse, and spouse became opponent. Sharing a home is difficult. Sharing contracts, royalties, and vetoes is combat in a nicer font. When things broke, they broke as filings and depositions translated love into clauses. Fans heard gossip while the industry heard a siren to guard paperwork, even when the songs felt invincible. The voice that charmed America still sounded like Sunday morning, but it had to testify in weekday language. It was a warning written in legalese for every kid with a guitar and a dream who is tempted to sign first and study later. Wynonna, Judd, and Dr. Roach ended at full volume with cameras already rolling. Papers were filed days after an arrest, and the timeline told its own story. Wynonna did not hide in a farmhouse while strangers wrote the script. She met the glare, chose careful words, and kept the work moving. That is not the tidy resilience of a greeting card. It is the practical kind that pays the crew, protects the kids, and saves a voice built to fill arenas. She kept singing from the middle of a storm and gave interviews that chose dignity over spectacle, not because it sells better, but because it heals cleaner. Kristofferson and Reba Coolidge looked like a sepia photograph you could hear. A poet with boot scuffs and a singer with velvet steel tried to build a home between airports. Touring is jealous and schedules grind tenderness into sawdust. By 1980, the marriage sighed and set down its bags. The music from that era carries honesty without cruelty, proof that two adults can end a chapter without burning the library they built together. They left behind a map for grown-ups who wish to separate without starting a war, a minor miracle in a business that rewards explosions. June Carter and Carl Smith came before the famous duet the world celebrates. She was lightning with jokes and grit. He was a smooth chart king. Their 1956 split reminded Nashville that even royalty takes a turn at the courthouse. Closing that door gave June space she did not yet know she would need. Fate rarely announces itself, but sometimes clearing a room is the first step toward the life you were meant to sing. Her next life would require courage and endurance, but that day was only paperwork, an ordinary threshold on the way to an extraordinary fate. Jerry Lee Lewis and Myra Gale Brown remain the blinking caution light. He walked the wire between rock and country. She was the too young bride the public rejected. By 1970, the filings listed Payne in careful legal ink. His second act in country could not outrun the first scandal because the past hires better publicists than any label. Every comeback carried a footnote no promoter could erase. Every encore carried the same question humming under the applause, and the answer never changed the past, even when the music felt immortal. Shania Twain and Robert Mutt Lange built a rocket and learned what happens when the boosters separate. She remixed the 90s with glitter and strength. He sculpted pop until it cut glass. Their 2010 split hurt not only because it ended a marriage, but because the wound seemed shaped like a friendship. Shania's next chapter, marrying the other half of that broken trust, read less like revenge and more like recovery. She refused to let betrayal draw the border of her life, and the audience followed the melody rather than the whispers. Fans stopped rubbernecking and started rooting because composure reads louder than spectacle when the hook is strong and the voice stays true. Reba McEntire and Narvel Blackstock ended a 26-year run most of Nashville assumed was permanent architecture. Reba said the decision was not hers, and then did what pros do. She worked, toured, and recorded, smiling like someone who knows a spotlight is a tool, not a sun. The plot twist landed, the crew reset the stage, and the show continued with the precision of a veteran who trusts her footing. If heartbreak can look professional, she made it so, a master class in refusing to let a personal shock rewrite a public legacy. Faith Hill had a first marriage before the arena romance with Tim McGraw. That earlier ending is not scandal, it is alignment. She closed a door that looked sensible on paper and stepped into the partnership that would redraw tours and radio. Some choices are called impulsive until time proves they were simply honest. Faith's career and life took their shape the moment she chose the path that actually fit. The quiet courage of that pivot hides in plain sight on the records that followed, where certainty sounds like a clear bell. Rosanne Cash and Rodney Crowell built a house of songs and then used the same lumber to raise 2 new addresses. Their breakup never felt like demolition. It sounded like thoughtful carpentry by adults who understood that love and respect can survive new floor plans. The records around and after 1992 have sharper lines, deeper quiet, and a confidence that needs no shouting. Listeners were not asked to judge. They were invited to recognize themselves in the margins. They wrote with empathy sharp enough to cut through nostalgia, and both of them kept the promise to write the truth, even when it stung. Merle Haggard and Bonnie Owens modeled grown-up steadiness in a genre that sometimes rewards tantrums. They divorced and kept working together, passing microphones like neighbors trading sugar. There was no villain to cast, only 2 professionals protecting what still worked. Country often confuses volume with strength. Their restraint proved how powerful quiet can be. Audiences rewarded the grace with long applause, grateful to watch 2 adults proofread their history instead of tearing out the pages. Willie Nelson and Shirley Collie delivered a twist so clean it felt like fiction. A hospital bill arrived with a surprise, and the story most people thought they knew split down the middle. Willie folded the fallout into an already sprawling myth, the shrug of a charmer who knows he is not always the hero. The music did not blink. The brand kept walking, hat low, guitar steady, honesty intact. Folklore absorbed the story, and Willie's shrug turned into another verse about penance and luck sung from the back of a bus, rolling past midnight diners. Tammy, Wynette, and Don Chappell supplied the short fuse that lit a bigger fire. A dinner table argument became lore, retold in dressing rooms and columns. Whether every detail is courtroom precise matters less than the trajectory. Tammy left, the furniture of her life moved, and a defining partnership snapped into place. Sometimes the mess is the map that points exactly where you needed to go. Country lives on those pivots, the moments when humiliation becomes momentum and a new harmony appears right where the argument ran out of breath. Glenn Campbell and Sarah Barg lived the chapter before the storm. They married in the mid-70s, welcomed a child, and were finished by 1980. His next romance grabbed headlines while this one faded into context. Breaking up while famous turns a private ache into an open-book test scored by strangers. Glenn kept playing anyway, because a clean solo on time can still silence a room built for gossip. He walked on stage with a grin that said work still matters, polishing the melody while the tabloids chased smoke down hallways. Hank Williams Jr. and Becky White stand at the crossroads where inheritance meets reinvention. The late 70s turned him from heir apparent into Bocephus, a brand with scars and stubborn pride. Somewhere in that metamorphosis, a marriage rose and fell. When your last name feels like a dare, home can pay for the ambition that finally sets you free. The records grew louder and more defiant, and the man matched them, building a legacy that did not need a museum to explain itself. He found a spine no one could deny, and even the family name began to sound less like expectation and more like a flag he had earned. Porter Wagoner and Ruth Williams finished like a storm that takes years to pass. The filings read tight-jawed and formal, full of long separations and phrases that pretend to be polite while naming real pain. The public remembers his creative split with a partner more than the end of his marriage, but the paperwork explains the era's manners. Some endings are not dramatic. They are simply overdue, and everyone breathes easier when the sky finally clears. When the signatures finally dried, everyone involved seemed relieved to call the weather what it was and move toward clearer air. Return to George and Tammy for the lesson you cannot shake. Paperwork can sever a union, but it cannot silence a blend that once braided 2 lives. They kept singing, and the audience bought those songs like souvenirs from a battlefield. Beauty survived the blast because heartbreak does not end, it modulates. It changes keys and comes back louder than memory. And remember the quieter collateral stories circling these headlines. Managers who lost a client and a friend, steel players relearning parts because a harmony partner no longer rode the bus, and kids measuring school years by visitation weekends instead of summer tours. Labels scrambled artwork. Publicists drafted statements that tasted like chalk. Radio programmers pretended not to notice when a lyric sounded like evidence. Inside kitchens, mothers packed merch bins, dads learned how to braid hair during interviews, and grandparents became roadies for bedtime. Churches whispered prayers, bars kept secrets, small towns picked sides like football crowds. Through it all, the songs kept clocking in like sunrise, paying rent on broken apartments and patching holes in faith. The industry moved on, but the echoes stayed, humming beneath every steel lick like a memory refusing to sit down. Here is the thesis without perfume. Country music sells aftermath. It sells the moment a suitcase sits open on a bed and you decide which self makes the trip. These divorces did not only end chapters, they taught artists to narrate pain without drowning in it, to turn a bad night into a bridge and a bridge into a paycheck. What remains more than scandal is resilience. Reba turned goodbye into a runway. Shania redrew the border of her life. Roseanne and Rodney converted grief into craft. Merle and Bonnie protected what still worked. Even the ugliest chapters, with arrests and lawsuits that read like diaries, proved something stubborn and hopeful. If you can name your pain, you can narrate it. And if you can narrate it, you can own the echo that follows you onto the stage. These tales orbit radios and feeds because they explain the bargain artists make. You give the world your best lines and sometimes your worst moments. The world applauds and then flinches, and you keep breathing in between. If fortune smiles, the songs outlast the storm and you find a self you can live with. If fortune snarls, the storm becomes a brand and you spend years trying to outsing thunder while strangers order another round. So when someone jokes that country is 3 chords and the truth, remember what truth costs. It is a custody calendar pinned to a fridge and a headline you cannot unsay. It is a lawyer pronouncing your name in a room that echoes. It is a tour bus mattress where a vow used to be and a hotel hallway where 2 artists pass without speaking, each pretending the other is invisible while knowing the next record will confess what their mouths will not. It is also a voicemail you never replay and a ring tucked in a drawer for good. Maybe that is why these stories still compel. Hank and Audrey feel like prologue to modern ballads. Garth and Sandy's numbers make civilians gasp. Kenny's grin looks more weathered in hindsight. Wynonna's measured words cut shame away. Willie can confess without pretending he is spotless. Reba turned a quake into a scene change, and the crowd kept time without missing the downbeat. File one more truth where you keep the good bridges. Scandal ages fast. Songs resist rust. The divorces become trivia and the choruses become tradition. Somewhere a kid in a borrowed pickup is learning a George Jones wail without knowing the court dates behind it. Somewhere a shopper mouths a Roseanne cash line with no idea about the kitchen where it was written. Somewhere a couple in a small bar sways to Shania, unaware of how much resolve it took to sound that gracious. This was never a pity parade. It is a salute to flawed legends who turned breakups into blueprints and handed those blueprints to anyone bold enough to start over. Settlements fade and rumors drift like old smoke. What lasts is grit, the decision to show up on the night you least want to, the nerve to write down the ugly parts and rhyme them anyway, the humor to crack a joke when silence wants the room, and the courage to keep loving your work and your life out loud. In the end, country love stories do what they have always done. The divorces harden into folklore, and the songs stay young. When the lights go down and the first chord lands, nobody counts scars or zeros. They count beats until the line they came to sing, the one that hurts just right, the one that makes them feel seen, the one some legend scribbled on a napkin the night everything fell apart and the music showed up anyway. That is the inheritance, and it still pays dividends every time a voice steps to a microphone and refuses to pretend. File these names under education, not only entertainment. They show how art absorbs impact and still rings clear. They prove that endings can finance beginnings when handled with courage. They remind any singer that the hardest work truly begins after the house goes dark.